Welcome everyone, this is Georges, and this will be a different type of video. In the background, there will be gameplay of my account as I'm grinding the Seraph's rerun. So, since you already know the title of this video, you should already know what I'm going to be talking about. Why do I play Fate Grand Order? I'm not an American, and neither do I belong to any of the other countries that appear as an option when starting the game. Well, if you are aware of the type of Fate content that I do, you should already have an idea that I'm not just a Fate Grand Order player, but also a Fate franchise fan. Now, I could go on a story of how I got into Fate to begin with, which in itself is actually quite funny, but essentially I have been a Fate fan since the anime came out. Yes, the Dean one. I know, shocking. And while I do think that the Fate IP is what ultimately pulls me the most towards Fate Grand Order, there's things that FGO does for me that makes it work, whereas other gacha games don't really manage to do it. And if they do, they don't do it that well. And believe me, I've played a lot of gacha games. Pretty much any gacha game that comes out, I download it and try it out. Yet only Fate seems to capture my attention. Now, obviously I've been playing FGO for a long time, and that time and money investment will keep my attention more than a brand new game. But I've also abandoned other games that I put some initial money in and a lot of time in. And the question I always make is, why? What does FGO do that the others don't? Gameplay wise, FGO is quite dated. There's a lot of gacha games out there that have a much more dynamic and visual fighting. And I think most players will agree that FGO's gameplay, while well made, is nothing special. So let's talk about other games that I've tried. Let's start with the IP games. If you don't know what an IP game is, they are games based on already existing media. For example, FGO is an IP game because it's based on the Fate franchise. Bleach, Naruto, Overlord, Seven Deadly Sins, One Punch Man, etc. All of these are IP games. They are games that try to sell you by throwing at you your favorite characters of existing medias. They can be different degrees of cash grabbing, and let's be honest, when FGO first came out, everyone knew that it was a cash grab, and there was very little hope for it to become its own thing. Luckily though, DreamWorks managed to salvage that train wreck. So, what is it that IP games have as a general problem that FGO doesn't? Well, for starters, they don't try to explain the gacha system. In FGO, the gacha system is part of the story. It is the summoning system. There is a logic as to why you can have 6 different Arturias in the same team. In many of these other IP games, there isn't an explanation. It's just gameplay, and it is treated as gameplay and nothing else. Seven Deadly Sins is a very good example of this, because it's actually a very good game. It was clearly made with a lot more thought than many of the other IP games. But it has the same issue. The gacha system is just there for monetary reasons. There is no tie-in for the story. And that leads to another problem. Most IP games are simply unoriginal. Wow, what a shocker. But it's an issue that highlights future problems for these IP games. FGO does what many of these IP games never dared to do. FGO tries to sell you brand new original characters. I do not know another IP game that does the same. And maybe I'm just forgetting one, but as far as I can remember, of all the ones I've tried, it's the same old same. Sell already existing characters, and when there's an event, just sell the same character with a different pose and clothes. And that's the issue. You know from the get-go that when you play one of these games, all you will have is an already existing cast, and eventually they will run out of content because the original IP already ended, and now it's time to recycle old characters in different clothes and poses. And don't get me wrong, FGO does similar things, but most of them are annual events such as Christmas and summer, and the different classes make enough of a twist that despite being the same identity, they can sometimes feel like completely different characters. There's also another issue with these IP games. Despite being games that try to sell to you by throwing your favorite characters at your face constantly, there's surprisingly a lack of bonding feature in them. You would think that they would at least let you bond with these fictional characters that you love, but they can't do it because there's no logic to it. The gacha system is not part of the story, it's not explained, so the player technically doesn't even exist in the game. What would these characters be bonding with? For me, FGO is probably what you should look at as an example of how to make an IP game. If you go through the FGO community, you will find so many players that have max bounded and grailed low rarity servants simply because they like them, truly allowing them to enjoy the game with a character they like, even if they might not be popular. But in many of these IP games, it's very clear what they do. They pick the more popular characters as the most rare, and the least popular characters as the low rarities. So if you like one of the unpopular characters, well, good luck, cause they're not only are they low rarity, but there's no way to make them viable. And for me, that's what kills most IP games. There's nothing new about them. They will eventually run into the same old recycling of characters. They are mostly cash grabs, and for games that try to sell you your favorite characters, there's no bonding features that make you feel like you've achieved something once you've acquired them. But what about original games? As I mentioned before, FGO does something that the vast majority of IP games doesn't dare to do. FGO tries to sell you brand new original characters. Well, how does it stand against original games that only have new characters to sell? Well, they still fall into the same issue. There is no gacha game out there that I can remember that incorporates its gacha system and you, the player, so well into its story. Many of these games have a main character that the story follows, but this main character is actually just a collectible character for you, the player, meaning that the player is not actually part of the story, they are just the viewer. And you might think that that's not that relevant, but it is. That makes a lot of difference. The FGO community is gigantic, especially in the fan art community. There's so much drawings out there of players drawing their own perception of how their main character behaves with their own favorite servants. And you might not believe it, but the artist community of a fan base has a lot of control over the boom of the game community. The more active the community, the more it grows. And what better way to make a community active than sharing your own little experiences as a player? It's especially fun watching artists draw their gacha experiences and rolling their favorite servants, only to then lash out at the servant for burning their wallet or credit card. And this is something that I've noticed that FGO has more than other gacha communities. There's a disconnect in most other gacha games between the players and the characters that they want to sell you. Now, not all of them, mind you, but it's very clear that FGO managed to hit the nail on the head compared to other gachas. There's also the issue of PvP. When I visit most other gacha communities, if the gacha has PvP, then the vast majority of the conversation is about PvP, and what characters to ignore and which ones to use. Like, think that for a second. Obviously, for the purposes of winning, using the best tools is ideal, but what's the logic of making a game with the purposes of selling characters to players when then those same players will tell other players which ones to go for and which ones to ignore? Aren't you just shooting yourself on the foot by adding PvP? If the new character you make isn't good enough, then everyone will bash it and mock anyone that might actually like the character. Compare that to the FGO community, which has no PvP, where most players are just flexing at each other their devotion to their favorite character. I'm not saying that PvP is fundamentally a bad concept, but in a game where the goal is to sell you characters that you like, adding PvP is a double-edged sword. Yes, you are making more money from the competitive players that only want to win and that will wail to have the most powerful character maxed out. but you're also making less money because any character that you make that fails to meet the requirements to be competitive will simply be ignored. Even worse, anyone who expresses how they like the non-competitive character will likely be mocked, then resulting in players leaving the game. Basically put, PvP is in general bad civilization in gacha games. Now, there's a lot more reasons on what made certain games just not work for me, but that would require me to go on very small details for each game. However, I think these reasons should be enough to explain why I enjoy FGO so much compared to other gacha games that I've played. But what about you? What is your reason to play FGO? And what other gacha game do you play or that you liked but ultimately abandoned? For me, I really liked Epic 7, but I could not for the love of God get used to the voice acting in that game. Both the original Korean and English were horrible to listen to. And when I heard that there was going to be a Japanese version, I hopped back in thinking that there would be a Japanese dub version. But no, Japanese would get their own server, so no Japanese voice acting for me. Also, I know that Fire Emblem's gacha game does a lot of good things that FGO does. However, its biggest problem is its predatory monetization system. Whoever thought it was a good idea to be able to summon the same character but with different stats should be burned at a stake. But anyway, don't take this personal if you like any of the games that I mentioned. In the end, we play what we like and that's all that matters. If you enjoy my content, like the video and subscribe. Also, leave a comment down below, and until next time, bye.